After 18 years working as an engineer, Michael Frew got frustrated with being an employee and with trying to start new businesses. And he had an aha moment. What if he bought an existing successful online business instead? So, is acquiring an online business a better path for tech professionals compared to starting from scratch? With over a decade of experience acquiring and operating multi-million dollar software companies, Michael Frew provides a unique perspective on the pros and cons of acquiring versus starting an online business, especially if you're an engineer or IT professional and an introvert to boot. Welcome to the Online Business Launchpad podcast. I'm your host, Trudy Rankin, bringing you stories and advice from successful online entrepreneurs, because if they can do it, so can you. I've spent over 8 years building my own online business, and now I'm passionate about helping others build their business. My mission is simple. I want to help you overcome challenges so that you can live life on your terms. If you're ready to dive into the world of online business, stick around as we explore whether acquiring an existing business could be a better path for you than starting from scratch. Let's get into it. Welcome to the Online Business Launchpad podcast. I'm your host, Trudy Rankin. And today our guest is Michael Frew. And Michael Frew has worked as an engineer and a software architect for several top corporations that you will have definitely heard of. Corporations like Lockheed Martin, IBM, Microsoft, Amazon, Salesforce, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And he also has an MBA in business and economics and a bunch of postgraduate information security certifications or certificates. You can call them whatever you want. After years of working as an engineer and a software architect, he changed course and he decided to get into what he calls acquisition entrepreneurship, where he acquired multiple 6- and 7-figure software or software as a service companies. Now, Michael is currently managing an 8-figure portfolio that's generating a 7-figure annual pre-tax income. That's a lot of money. And based on his experience, he has some really interesting opinions on why IT professionals should stop trying to start a business and buy a business instead. And he's going to talk a little bit about what makes developers, engineers, and other technically experienced professionals really excellent online business acquirers and operators. So he's going to talk about that, and he's going to share his 8-step framework for finding, financing, and acquiring online companies. And he's going to share the top 4 frequently asked questions about pursuing a career in online business acquisitions. So thank you so much for being on the podcast, Michael.
Wow, that was a fantastic intro. Thank you so much for having me.
No worries. Thank you for being on the podcast. So as we were talking a little bit earlier, just for listeners who know so much about me personally, I have a background as a chief information officer, and I work with engineers and software people and architects and information architects, software architects. And it can be really interesting talking to them, understanding how they think, how they view the world, and the way they work. And there's some brilliant people out there. There's a lot of really good people out there. But it can be really hard to get people to listen to you if they're not in that space. And so for me, making the break from being in the world of information, chief information officer and stuff, took quite a lot of doing. You have to change your mindset. You have to do a lot of things, and it's hard work starting a business. And I'd really like you to share, Michael, if you would, just a little bit about why you went from what you were doing to what you're doing now, and just a little bit about that. And then we're going to get stuck into the other stuff.
Great question. So it comes down to the origin story of how this got started. And like many of your listeners, just a regular developer, engineer, and doing this with multiple companies. But there always felt like it wasn't quite exactly what I should be doing. And I could never put my finger on it. I think a lot of us in the corporate world suffer a little bit from this challenge where we've lost a little bit of the passion for development because of all the outside stuff that has to happen. And so I went through what I call a few quarter life crises where I just upped and quit the job with no idea what I was going to do, but I had just gotten so frustrated with where I was. And developers, IT professionals, we have a problem because we get some golden handcuffs because we're paid so well. So it's very hard for us to just laterally move somewhere else. If we say, you know what, tech isn't for me, I'm going to go somewhere else, you quickly find that's a little challenging if you've already established anything or have people that you're responsible for. So I kept coming back into the same world, but I would approach it a different way. One time I went out and got an MBA and then came back into the IT world. And finally, after about 18 years, I was still struggling to figure what exactly is it that's bothering me about technology, because I still love to develop things. I still love to work on projects, talk with engineers. And somewhere in there, I found the idea of what if instead of trying to start my 18th failed startup idea, what if I just bought one that's already working? And so I just experimented just a tad, bought something that was just a small, it was 5-figure business. And so this did like Amazon affiliate, and just to see how much I enjoyed running an online business. I think like a lot of your listeners, if you're here, you're already learning and you're getting that financial literacy of how to run your own business. So I had a lot of that background. I had bought all the courses and I just didn't have the business to run and practice with all those courses that I had spent all the time with. So once I got the small one, I thought that was just fantastic. And that completely shifted my mindset from trying to go back and get new jobs to I want to go out and acquire the projects I want to work on.
I think that's an interesting mind, because listeners will know that I purchased a business, which is a content-based website, just late last year. And that's been a journey and an interesting mindset shift as well. But one of the things that I have always said in the back of my mind, that I am never, ever going to buy a software as a service business, because I know how complicated they are, how many moving parts they have, and how tricky it can be. So just for the benefit of our listeners, especially if someone's listening who is an engineer or an IT professional or whatever, what kind of questions do they typically ask? And how could you help them move through that mindset shift from, hey, I'm an employee, to, hey, maybe I should buy a business, but I can't figure it out, to maybe I should buy a business?
Yes. And this really goes to the core of why I'm even doing these interviews on podcasts, to get this message out, because what you just asked is pretty much what I hear every time I bump into an engineer and they ask what I do. Most of the time, they're going to say, that sounds pretty fun. How in the world do I do that? And so questions I always get, if it's a cocktail party or something just in a social environment, it's what kind of a niche would be good for me? Like you said, I'm in the software SaaS space. You've looked at content. You can do e-commerce, Amazon, you can do Kindle books. There's a lot of niches to do. So trying to figure out what was a good niche for someone based on their background and their interests. Another question is, of course, how do I become a competitive buyer, right? A lot of good businesses are going to have a lot of people trying to acquire it. We have the same problem that regular M&A has, and even real estate, where it's really deal flow that makes a big difference. So you're always trying to improve your deal flow. So how can you be a buyer that sellers want to sell to, right? And so that's a good question. Third one, of course, is always going to be, how in the world do I finance this? And so there's a bunch of pieces to talk about that. And many reasons that I'm, again, doing the podcast is to try and talk to myself maybe 10, 15 years ago, saying, hey, if this is something you might like to do when you get into like maybe middle management, start saving some money, start working in different parts of your company so you can get experience in marketing. You already have the engineering experience. If you could get anything inside of like accounting, that can be really helpful when you run your own business. And then the fourth question is, so how do I start? Where do I go? I can probably solve those first three. What do I do next? So I just put together 4 videos. I think they're each like a half hour long of me just explaining all that as if we were just sitting down at a bar and talking about it, to help get people thinking and doing that mindset change of, this is a little bit of what would change versus working continually in a corporate career.
And we'll put those links to those videos in the show notes so that people can go and access those later. That'll be really great. I'm sure people will be interested in those. Talk us through your framework that you use to just go from zero to something that's going to really not just bring in the money, but be a satisfying thing to be working on yourself.
And that's really the important thing here is, for me, when I see something for sale, I'm thinking back to, I would be handed projects in the corporate world. And sometimes they were fun. Sometimes you knew they were going to go nowhere. You would do an MVP demo and nobody was ever going to use it. And that can be so disheartening. So for me, there are definitely acquirers that go out there, they look at the numbers, they plug it into a spreadsheet and it tells them yes or no. I'm more interested in, is this something that I would enjoy doing every morning? Is this a customer base that I enjoy talking to? So for me, that's more engineers. I really love buying engineering tools, infrastructure, SaaS companies. Then I get to talk to developers and engineers all day. But if you like talking to consumers, there's B2C companies you can look at. So really, you get to choose that project and who your customers are. So when we look at like the framework, it's how do you structure it so that you're getting projects that you would like to do? And some of them are large enough to be businesses. Some are small projects that you can roll into another business. So we start generally on the framework with some of those 4 questions we just talked about. What's suitable for you? What can make you an exceptional buyer? What do you need to do to improve? How do we work with financing? So we start with those. And then you have to go out there and start working on that deal flow. You start having conversations with sellers. So there's a big step in there of, what are we going to have to discuss with sellers? How do you get them to like you? How do you find out if the business they're selling is something you would enjoy doing? What happens if you want to make an offer? What do those timelines look like? What is important to you? What's important to the seller? How do you find those negotiation pieces? If you move forward to actually go with a closing, what happens before closing? How do you move the money around? What do you do closing day? And then you have the transition period, which can be anywhere from 1 day to 30 days to even longer. And like you touched on a little earlier, some can be very quick, right? So this path, people may recognize that sounds very similar to buying a real estate asset. It's very similar. And that can go very quickly if everything is really aligned, or it can take a much longer time, especially for software and SaaS, because there are so many moving pieces. So each deal is unique. They all match in that framework. And there's some parts we need to expand a little bit more on, and some parts where you can go a lot quicker with it.
There's a lot there. And in terms of that process where you're going from, let's find something that I'm going to enjoy. How do I manage that process of starting to talk to the seller, developing a relationship with the seller, and convincing them that you would be somebody who's a pair of safe hands? Because certainly from my own experience of buying the content website that I bought, that was one of the most important parts of the whole process, was getting to know the person, understanding deeply what they were trying to do with the business and why they were doing it and who they're trying to help. And so what kinds of, I guess, tips can you offer based on your experience for just handling that part of the process, that whole figuring it out and then relationship building to the point where that person would even consider selling to you?
I think you've pulled out a really interesting piece, because my general thought when I started this was I glanced right over the seller call because I figured it was all buyers are all the same. Sellers are just going to want to sell for the most money. And it turns out that is not true. Just like you implied, these entrepreneurs or someone that's working this business, this might be their most important thing. Career-wise, it might be one of the best paydays they're ever going to have, but they still care about what happens to their customers. They still care about the mission of what they were doing, especially if it's a tool that's scratching their own itch. They don't want to then turn that over to somebody that's just going to outsource it overseas. 2 years later, it fizzles out and the person was just wasting their time. So that's part of that seller conversation, is learning whether the buyer wants to do that, is interested in the mission of the business. And at least me personally, I really want the seller to stay involved, not financially or any time piece, but if I could call you in 6 months and say, hey, here's where the business is today, where else would you maybe look at? How else can we do this better? Because that's the person that originally had that mission idea in their mind. So that can be really helpful too. And to show a little bit that I do care what happens to the business in the end. But it's going to be different for each acquirer. Like I said earlier, some really just put the numbers in. If it works, here's exactly what we're going to offer, and here's exactly what we're going to do. Whereas mine, I think I do a little bit more on a personal relationship, because you're going to work with the seller for quite some time. So it's pretty beneficial to be friends when you go into the closing. Most of the time, I'll actually fly out and visit with the seller, and we'll sit down and go through the company as well. I think that's pretty rare. So that's a tip that people could try if you've got the time to do that. But yeah, never underestimate how important these seller conversations are, because it's not quite something you can just gloss over like it may seem at first.
I'm still certainly in touch with the person that I bought basically the website from, and they've been really helpful, because just whether you want to or not, most of the time you've closed the sale and then stuff starts coming out of the woodwork. Things start showing up that you never even thought could be an issue. And you're going, what is going on here? And you can reach out to that person and ask them, do you know anything about this? Can you help with this? And if you've got a good relationship, they're going to be willing to help you with that, which is really important.
Absolutely. I think you're touching on a piece I think a lot of developers, engineers, IT professionals, we all encounter, is it's very hard to remember what it was like when you didn't understand what you were doing. And we see, and it causes a lot of issues with IT, because that's why we all seem more mean to the new people. We're like, how come you can't figure this out? Why is this so hard? That happens in your own business. I've been running one. My first large acquisition was almost 10 years ago. And I now struggle to try and teach someone how to do it, because to me, it just happens, right? And I can do a whole day's worth of work in about an hour, and somebody else, it'll take them 8 hours. So yeah, you're going to have these things. They pop up monthly. Sometimes they'll pop up quarterly. And then you always have annual things that pop up where you want to reach out to the seller and say, hey, do you remember this from November of 2022? Having a conversation with somebody that just wrote us back after 13 months. So yeah, always helpful to stay in touch.
Yeah, for sure. So in terms of that, the due diligence process, and by due diligence, I mean the point in time where you're asking questions, you've decided you want to buy it, but you want to make absolutely 100% sure that this is the right thing for you. What kind of questions would you be asking as a potential buyer if you were going to be buying a SaaS company or a software as a service company.
And I think in my excitement to describe the framework, I completely skipped over the due diligence phase. So that is a big piece of it. And you're right, each niche has a different pieces that you really need to dig into. If it's a content site like yours, you're really going to want to authenticate that traffic, make sure it's all above board. And so that's something that you're going to focus on quite a bit. SaaS and software, you're going to look at how valuable are the customers, how sticky are they? You're looking at the churn numbers. How likely is it that some of these are going to renew either monthly or annually? One thing that can be a little tricky with SaaS and software is it's very hard to do a code review. Sellers sometimes aren't really interested in that. And that might be, remember I mentioned that I would fly out. So we can sit down in a room and have the seller walk us through during due diligence what the code base looks like so we can get an idea of what we're walking into. Excuse me. And one thing does happen, and it happens with people selling their houses, it happens with people selling their business. Once you start in that mindset, that becomes a little bit of your full-time job and you're not running the business as much. And since this process can take a few months, even up to a year, you start to find maybe some of the code base has gotten a little bit old. Some of the stuff hasn't been updated to the newest versions. So it's something you should accept. And a little bit like you said in the beginning, that SaaS and software, there's a ramp up when you get it where you have to go back and fix some things. You have to find what the scalability problems are going to be in the future. So I always say that first year with a software business, we're just going to try not to break it. We're just going to learn what's going on, get everything upgraded, and we'll start really throwing some gas on the fire in year 2. But right at first, let's just get it all straight. So yeah, due diligence can be very different for each kind of, it's not really asset class, but each niche inside of the online business world.
And every different type of asset that you can buy online has got some different things that you have to pay attention to very specifically. I want to come back to something that I think may affect some businesses, depending on how much money you have, obviously. And that is whether or not the business that you're looking at buying has got investors involved in terms of if you're looking at the business and the business was able to be developed through investor funding, how do you deal with, or how do you find out and how do you deal with the fact that there's this, it's something that you're responsible for kind of managing and making sure is sorted out and settled? How do you deal with all that?
This is a good question. And I'm honestly probably not the best authority at this. I would love to ask this question from some others. What I have encountered is sometimes the entrepreneur or the entrepreneurial team will have very small silent investors as well. But this is more of a friends and family situation. What I think you might be speaking of that we would encounter more often is, let's say it's a Y Combinator company, right? And so that there's investment in there and they're just looking to exit. They know it's not going to be a unicorn. They're fine with just get us our money back and we'll go try somewhere else. Those situations I usually shy away from because while you're asking that question, because it makes it a little bit more complicated, you get a few more lawyers in there. And at that point, I feel that might be a better business to sell to someone that has done that a few times, that has the legal team that's ready to tackle those kind of problems. Because you're right, that can really mess up a sale if you have one person that just isn't going to work with it. So for me, I'm not sure I'm the best at answering it, but what I am describing is find your niche and know what isn't part of your niche. That's somewhere where if I see 3 or 4 different private investors in there that we have to sort out, I might step away from that and go look for a different business.
And just out of curiosity, where would you typically go to find businesses that you might want to buy?
Yes. So when I started about a decade ago, it was a little bit of the Wild West out here. Online business acquisitions was just almost find it on forums and everything. It has really professionalized since. So there's 2 types of places that you can go. There's marketplaces. And so your listeners might be familiar with Flippa or Acquire.com, which used to be MicroAcquire. And then there's brokers. So if you're interested in SaaS brokers, there's one FE International, there's Empire Flippers, there's Quiet Light Brokerage. So they all work with sellers. And the big difference between marketplace and broker is with a marketplace, the seller isn't really going to have any broker education. So what you find as the acquirer or the buyer is that you have to teach the seller a little bit about what they're doing. As you can imagine, sometimes they come in with some pretty lofty ideas what the business might be worth. And you have to discuss, here's why I think it might be worth around here and why everybody else is going to say the same thing. But with the broker, that is already covered because the broker walks the person through it. So you get a much more professional presentation when you're selling through a broker, when the buyer sees it for the first time. Whereas from a marketplace, sometimes the buyer knows that there's a little bit of extra work. And in some cases would say, I just don't want to deal with that extra work. I might look somewhere else. So that's the difference between the two. It's pretty simple Google search just to find the good brokers. I would encourage you to reach out, explain a little bit of what your background is, what you are possibly looking to acquire, what price range you can handle, and they will put you on certain lists so that you can be notified right when those kind of businesses pop up.
There's quite a few out there. And just one last follow-up question with that. Do you think that depending on, once again, the amount of money that you're spending and whether this is your first time buying or maybe it's your 10th time buying, is that level of confidence that you get from working with a broker worth the brokerage fee?
And that's usually the complaint, right? Nobody wants to pay the broker fee. So my argument as a buyer is that you really want your business to sell to the best buyer, the person that's going to care for your business. You want it to be in a multi-offer situation where people keep bidding it up because they really enjoy it. That's a little bit harder to do if you're just doing it on your own. The marketplaces try and create that, but whatever that percentage of the broker fee, you're most likely going to recover that in a higher sale and also in the time that is saved. It's going to seem like a lot of work up front because the broker's going to ask for a lot. They're going to push back. They're going to try and figure out more about your business. It's going to be really frustrating. And then you think, God, I can't even believe I have to pay this person to be bothering me all the time. But it does long-term sell your business for a better amount. If you have sold a few times and you think, hey, I know exactly what people are looking for, then absolutely you can do a for sale by owner. But if it's your first time and you're looking to sell something 7 figures, take the little bit of a cost just to make sure that you get the best sale that you possibly can. Again, personal advice. I'm not a broker. I'm not even sure what their opinion of that description would be, but that's what I'm looking for because I know when I see a broker selling that the seller is serious about what they're doing.
I think that's the important takeaway from this particular point, and that is that as a buyer, if you're wanting just a little bit more surety or basically know that there's been some due diligence already being done, working with a broker is going to give you a little bit more confidence in that line. And if you're somebody who's 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 years ago, you bought a business or started a business and now you want to sell it, yes, you have to pay brokerage people or brokers to help you with pulling all the information together that a buyer wants to know, but it's going to be worth it because you're still going to have to do a lot of work to work with them, but you don't have to do that. All the professionalism and all the magic little bits that go with putting together a really professional looking presentation to promote your business. So I want to touch on another aspect of buying a SaaS business, and that is oftentimes IT professionals, software engineers, et cetera, don't always have people management experience. And when you're buying a SaaS company, typically, you wouldn't be the one going in there and taking over everybody's jobs. This is not possible. So how do you recommend that people go about covering that leap that you have to make from I'm an employee, I'm going to buy a business, and as soon as I buy that business, I'm going to have a whole team of people that I have to manage.
And that is part of becoming a business, right? And I think if you think of the average engineer, they're probably just like me. I'm very introverted, really not interested in running a large team. So the thing I always say is we already know the hardest part of running the business, which is how the technology works. We know how to manage technology teams. We know how to do forecasting for putting new projects together. That's something that if somebody isn't coming from the inside of engineering world is very hard for them to do. So I always say, start with that piece of confidence that you already know the hardest part about the business. Everything else we can learn. We can learn how to do marketing, or we can hire someone to do it. We can learn everything about bookkeeping. And if you look out across the world, and I'm looking out the window in my background here, and I'm looking at all the businesses that are out here in Las Vegas, and you've met a lot of those business owners sometimes, and you think, I can't even believe they can keep this business running. And we see celebrities that run businesses and you can't believe that they can even keep the thing afloat. So I always say, if they can do it, then all of us can do it too. So it is a bit of a step, especially for coming from an introverted background like myself. But what I always say is, so basically I took everything that I didn't like about my managers when I was in the corporate, and I try and run it differently. And so everybody I work with probably can self-describe as an introvert like myself. We work very asymmetrically. We don't have any standing meetings. I didn't even see my lead engineer for 3 or 4 years until Zoom came out. And so I try and run a business the way that I wish I was when I was younger, and that I wish my managers were like. So you're intimidated that you have to deal with people, but you get to treat them and work with them in a way that hopefully you enjoy and hopefully the team finds rewarding, and you find the right people that like that. So in that sense, it actually can be quite rewarding because you feel like you're helping liberate people from maybe a corporate culture that they didn't want in the first place.
And one of the main reasons why they might be leaving or wanting to buy a business. Just really quickly, follow-up question. The teams that come with a SaaS business, and obviously this is it depends of a question, but typically, do they tend to work on-site or do they tend to do the teams tend to work remotely from wherever?
Almost everything I've encountered is remote. We always laugh. We said we were remote before remote was cool. That's typically what you're seeing. And so the size of businesses that I'm acquiring, just for background here, is, to me, the entrepreneur takes a business from 0 to 1. And that's right about the point where the business is doing a lot more marketing, customer operations. And that's, entrepreneurs don't really particularly like to do that. They want to move to the next shiny thing. And so a couple of years ago, that would have been NFTs. Now all of a sudden it's AI. And that's where they would look to sell the business. So I pick it up from 1 and I try and take it to 10. So my job's kind of to scale it, build the team out a little bit bigger. So my point is, you're not starting with usually a very large team. You might be replacing the original entrepreneur, maybe a developer if that person doesn't want to come along. And then you're just adding pieces on top to then look to sell it to the next higher group that would take it from 10 to 100. So in many times it's not going to be you're taking over 10 people or 20 or 30. There are situations where that does occur. But again, that's something I shy away from because I'm not really interested in running a 20-person team. I really like the scalability of having just me and a couple people putting it together. So again, you get to choose the career you want, which I think is the massive advantage of doing it this way.
Definitely. In terms of, you mentioned that oftentimes you obviously replace the founder. Do you ever have founders who would like to stay on board and do an earnout? We can talk about the finance part of it in a minute, but does that ever happen?
Yes. Sometimes earnouts are a little bit required because of the complexity of the business or a particular situation with the business where the buyer wants the seller to stay on for a year, maybe 2. And that can be a sticking point because sometimes sellers really do want to wash their hands of it and leave. But what I've more often seen is the seller says, I don't want any earnout situation, but I will absolutely work for you maybe 20 hours a week at this set rate. So you're still carrying that knowledge and you have someone that can do knowledge transfer to your new team. You pay them, as an expense of the business. And that really makes sense to me because you get a little pushback from the earnout. I've seen that really hurt a lot of deals. And I would be the same way. If I'm selling a business, I'm ready to be done with it other than my counseling I would give you over the next few months. But yeah, the earnout, it's hard to get an entrepreneur to suddenly want to be an employee. So maybe a situation where you say, hey, let's just do part-time. We'll pay you contractor. You work when you want. That kind of can work a little bit better sometimes too.
So that instantly raises a question for me. What happens if they do that for 3 months and then they go, oop, I'm done? There's no lock-in clause. I can walk whenever I want. I'm a contractor. How do you manage that?
I cycle back to that seller call, right? Where is that relationship built with you? Almost every situation that I have, you can tell that the seller, they don't want to sell the business and have it fall apart. Everything that they just put together, they're just not going to run away. I've had one acquisition where I basically did the transfer with the seller and we never really talked again, but we didn't need to. But most of the time, they're still interested in making sure the business is successful. They do have still a lot of emotion wrapped up in it, even if they aren't part of it. So you're right. It's a risk. It's something maybe you have to factor in, and that could be something you affect with the price and say, all right, if an earnout is off the table, can we drop the price a little bit, set you up for a 6-month kind of contractor deal and try and work it out there? But yeah, I would focus back to that seller call and just make sure that relationship is there.
Okay, one more quick question about that transition from employee to owner, manager, etc. What if somebody who's interested in doing something like this, buying a business, a SaaS business, what if they go, I would, except for I really don't want to be a manager? Are you familiar with the entrepreneurial operating system concept? Which there's the person who's the ideator, the person who comes up with all the ideas, and then there's the chief operating officer, whatever you want to call that. And do you have, or have you had experience with situations where somebody's come in and gone, I definitely don't want to be the manager. I just want to go in there. I'll be the person who comes up with the ideas and I just want to code. Does that work effectively?
That is a really good question. And I have not encountered this. Okay. So I would not want to speculate on something that I'm not speaking from experience on. However, I would really enjoy hearing the answer to that question whenever you find the right person, because that is a good question. But yes, I don't have experience with it. So I would hate to just say something that maybe isn't based by any fact or any actual event.
So I guess my conclusion from that is, and based on my own experience as well, is that you're going to have to go through a period of time where you are growing as a person and you're growing from an employee mindset into a manager's mindset and learning how to, and it's not just a manager's mindset. You may be able to contract somebody or bring somebody in to do the management side of things, but you have to grow into a business owner's mindset, which is a completely different mindset than being an employee.
It's very true. It is not all roses like everybody tries to convince you online. There is a lot of stuff that you have to do that isn't fun. And if you think about, let's say from a liability perspective, so each of my companies is inside its own LLC. And so that means if I have 4 of them, I'm doing everything 4 times. I'm paying the same fees, filling out the same forms. I've got 4 tax returns. That is really what we spend a lot of time on as a business owner. You have to be able to put up with that kind of frustrating work to be able to do the really fun stuff, which is getting up, talking with engineers on customer service, seeing them solve their own unique business use case. That's the great part, right? And there are definitely, and I can tell you, there's days where I am just not into it. And it usually is around April every year. And yeah, it's a lot of work. You are going to have to make that mental jump. And so some people, they just don't want to do it. And I completely understand. A lot of my team, I've asked them, hey, do you want to invest with me? And I can help you learn how to go from this investor owner. Some have said, you know what? I am just perfectly happy working with you. I don't want to get into that ownership piece, and perfectly fine. And so it really is an interesting thing to see where people end up. Maybe an advantage I had was I did not know this was a career opportunity for so long that I had done almost a 20-year corporate career. So I was ready to make those kind of changes. Whereas maybe if I was 25, I would have thought, I'm not really ready to manage a large team because I'm still 25 and trying to figure this stuff out. But I had reached in the mid 30s when I thought, okay, I can probably manage people a little bit now. I've been doing it enough. So yeah, it could be somewhere on the cycle of your career path.
So let's just really quickly, before we start to wrap up, talk a little bit about the finance side of things. Like a lot of people, you basically said, look, if you're considering this and you start putting some money away, and yes, you do need to start putting some money away. But what happens if you've done that and you found a business that you'd really like to buy, you've made the decision, you want to make the leap? What kinds of ways have you experienced in terms of actually finding the funding for buying a business?
I'd say always think about it like buying a house where you want to save that 20% first. So make that as a focus for a while until you're in that area. And once you decide about what price size you want, there's different things you can layer in to build financing in there. So you have your own cash. You've obviously got friends and family cash. One thing that's quite popular is seller financing. So a lot of sellers know, hey, if I'm going to be selling a business at 7 figures or mid 7 figures, I'm probably going to have to carry 10, 20% in a seller financing note. It's not going to be crazy interest. It might be pretty cheap, but that just really helps the buyer out. I've actually acquired a 7-figure business where it was 50% the seller note. That is not common. It's usually a lot less. Yeah. And then now that the industry is maturing, you're starting to see lending vehicles that cater to online businesses. So there's a couple out there that will do loans based on, let's say, the MRR or the ARR of the business. And so I've used some of those in the past. The SBA is actually starting to do loans for online business, which is a huge, big shift, actually. So if you're looking for like an Amazon business, something that the SBA can wrap their mind around, they will do loans for that. I have never done it. And so I wouldn't want to say that I'm the expert at it. I've just overheard what other people in the industry have said. But that is a way to solve that problem where I think the SBA, and again, don't quote me on it, I think they say maybe 10, maybe 15% you have to put down. They'll cover the rest. It's all cash. So the owner or the seller doesn't even have to worry about any financing. So it can be a really good negotiation method, even though it might take a little while because it's the government. So that's how it goes. So there are all these different little ways that you can layer things in there.
Just quick question, SBA for our non-US based listeners is?
It's the Small Business Administration. They do loans for probably like a small business acquisitions. It's very common in the offline world. It just took a while before they could kind of transition to online because, as we know, online businesses usually don't have assets to repossess if everything goes bad. So somehow they worked it over in their own minds and they're good with it now.
I interrupted your flow of talking about different finance types. Were there any others to add to that?
It's one of those where you just have to keep in touch with what is changing. It does change quite fast. Even the financing I put together for my last acquisition in 2023 does not exist anymore because interest rates have changed so much. But there are more players getting into the market, especially now that interest rates would actually generate a return for a company to loan money. One of the problems might have been that nobody could make any money loaning for the last few years because they were so low. So we are every quarter, I'm seeing a new opportunity, maybe where you can layer in a little bit more financing and get maybe another 10% cut here and there. So it's financial literacy, stay involved in the market, sign up for newsletters from brokers. I try and put out a newsletter whenever I can get 5 free seconds, and just keep your eyes in here because there are ways to put it together if you don't have all the money you need up front.
It makes a lot of sense. Yeah, and if you want, we'll put the link to your newsletter in the show notes as well, if you want people to sign up for it. So we've come to the end of our time, but what I'd like you to do, if you would, is just once again, just really quickly, just summarize sort of your 8-step process.
So first thing we really look at is suitability for you. We look at what niche would be a good fit for you. We look at how are you going to do the financing. Then we look at how are you going to find deal flow. Then we look at how are you going to do the seller phone call to get to that offer point. We're going to look at how are you going to put in that first LOI or the kind of the offer that the seller would take. Then you're going to have the large due diligence period. You're going to look, hopefully that's successful. You're going to look at how you're going to do closing. And then the final step is basically how are you doing the transition so that as I always say, that the customers never even realize the business was sold. So those are all the steps that we go through. Again, very similar to real estate. So I don't think it's not like they're learning a lot of new things. There's just some different nuances with online business. And many of those nuances are actually easier than they are in the offline world. So hopefully that encourages people as well, just to dig into it. So yeah, that's pretty much the high level of what you're going to go through in almost all probably 6-figure and higher acquisitions. If they're a little smaller, you can skip some steps, but I would never encourage that. But I think there's a few things where you can tie in maybe the offer, the closing, and the due diligence all at the same time, something like that.
It's not so much skipping as it is crunching it all together. Michael, it's been really great talking to you and just talking about this whole different way of sort of making the leap from employee to something else. And it doesn't have to include starting a business. You can actually buy a business. You still have to learn a lot of the same skills, but you can shorten the time frame that it takes to go from one way of thinking about the world to another way of thinking about the world and actually earning a living from it. So if people are interested in learning more about you or in just checking out what you have to say, where would they find you?
So easiest is michaelfrew.com. So my last name is spelled Frew. So michaelfrew.com. I try and put out a newsletter. I've got a bunch of articles of my point of view. So most of the information that's out there is put out by brokers and marketplaces. So that is very helpful. It's fantastic, but it's also one-sided. In the real estate world, we want to hear from people more than just real estate agents. We want to hear from buyers and we want to hear from sellers too. So that's why I started writing of here's the perspective I see as a buyer. Here's maybe where I disagree with what some of the brokers are saying. And then the more I started looking at this, I realized I actually know a lot about selling because I see so many perspectives come through that I can see problems really quickly. And so if you're interested maybe and you've got a business that you might sell, I would love to always say, give me 5 minutes to look it over. And I'll point out the 4 or 5 things that I think would be the biggest issue. You've got 12 months to fix it. You can totally do that. So that's where I'm trying to help. But you can start right at my website. I try and post some stuff on LinkedIn, and that's also just Michael Frew as the LinkedIn URL. And so just reach out from there.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Michael.
Thank you for having me.
If you're a longtime listener to the Online Business Launchpad podcast, you'll know that I often talk about Patsling's SPI Pro community. Now, what you might not know is that I'm a founding member of that community. And every year I keep signing up because I get so much value out of it. For example, every month I meet with a mastermind group whose members are at the same spot on the entrepreneurial journey as I am. And we celebrate our wins and navigate challenges together. And if we want to chat in between meetings, we just easily jump into the space that's reserved just for our mastermind and just say whatever's on our mind. It's a really supportive space where we all keep growing in confidence and capabilities, knowing that someone or several someones have got our back. And that's not all the value I get from being part of the SPI Pro community. I have access to really relevant trainings that Pat has put together. Plus, I've connected with several amazing guests for my podcast, experts who shared invaluable insights with my audience. And the opportunities just keep coming. I've had the honor of being on Patsling's own podcast and even teaching other SPI Pro members about some of the things that I'm expert in. And being a part of the SPI Pro community, it's like having my own special group of advisors that I can reach out to anytime I need them. Imagine having that network at your fingertips, where every connection inspires and every interaction teaches something new. That's what SPI Pro is all about for me. It's more than a community. It's a place where we as entrepreneurs come together to push the boundaries of what we can achieve. So are you ready to be part of something bigger? To learn, share, and grow alongside fellow business owners who are just as driven as you? Check it out for yourself and see for yourself the difference a truly collaborative community can make. And if you'd like to use my affiliate link to sign up, go to onlinebusinessliftoff.com/SPI-Pro. If you do, I'll receive a small commission at no extra cost to you, for which I thank you. And once you're in the community, say hello, and I'll be delighted to show you around. So join me in the SPI Pro community, and let's reach new heights together. Once again, that's onlinebusinessliftoff.com/SPI-Pro. And we'll see you there.